Sego, everybody. I'm not wearing a silly hat today. The topic this week, I mean, all our topics are serious, but this one is particularly, we're getting into kind of more hardcore territory, and so I don't feel that levity is appropriate right now, so I'm just going to be my earnest self. So we're dealing with the topic of environmental violence, but also resistance, right? I've mentioned before, it's important to me in this course that despite some of the kind of negative things we hear about in terms of oppression of indigenous peoples through colonization over the past few centuries, that we always remember that indigenous peoples have always resisted, and there are many ways in which they continue to resist. So we can't kind of talk about one without the other. So one of the benefits also of learning some of the things that we've learned in terms of, say, stories and ideas about creation, worldviews, things like that, is that that comes back when we talk about resistance. So everything is connected. And this, I'm going to try to keep this PowerPoint, this video short, to give you more time to delve into the materials for this week. So we'll get right into it, and the goal here, I really hope that a lot of you watch this video in addition to watching the slides, because I really want to help you make those connections with everything. It's like everything we've done so far is kind of leading up to what we're talking about right now. So it's kind of not a culminating moment, because we're going to continue after to dig deeper into a whole bunch of things, but it's kind of, there's definitely a path that we've taken to get to where we are now. So, just to bounce off of last week, this was in the middle, this is a repeat slide from last week where we talked about forms of colonialism, and just to kind of reiterate that early colonization took that form of exploitation colonialism, which was mostly economic in nature, right? These colonial powers, the British, the French up here in the north, others in further south, the Dutch in this area a little bit as well, kind of came, and it was more for economic, gain, right? And there was some exploitation of people and lands going on. The intent was not to stick around at first. And then eventually settler colonialism began to happen as people kind of started to say, wow, there's all this, big, beautiful land here and waters, and we could just come and settle here, and we're crowded over in our European countries. Let's spread out over here. Right? And that required displacing indigenous peoples, right? Moving them out of the way so that settlers could occupy more space. Now, in what we now know as Canada, I kind of said settler colonialism replaced exploitation colonialism, and now I added a sort of. I don't want you to have the impression that it is a replacement in the sense that exploitation colonialism is limited to economic benefits for the homeland. But that doesn't mean that exploitation of lands went away. In fact, it's very much an integral part of settler colonialism. So it can be misleading to say that settler colonialism replaced exploitation colonialism. It's kind of maybe more that they merged with each other. And so that leads us to what we're talking about this week. I also want to reiterate some stuff about what we talked about last week in these slides, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted in 2007. And as we mentioned last week, these four nations originally refused to sign, and that's relevant to one of the things we're talking about this week. And we'll see why. And I'm not going to read these word per word, but just to remind you of a couple of relevant articles in this declaration from the UN. So here, no relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples concerned. Okay? Not being forcibly removed from their land. And the right to redress, seek equitable compensation, and things like that. And again, there's this mention of free, prior, and informed consent. So that was Canada's objection to signing this declaration. They were really worried about this idea of free, prior, and informed consent, because if you're let's say it. I'm just gonna say it, okay? If you're a bully and you want to take people's stuff, you're a bully and a thief, and you want to take people's stuff, and somebody wants to institute some kind of law or regulation that it's going to keep you from doing that, because then you need the person's permission to take their stuff. You're not going to like that, are you? So Canada was not fond, and they still are not fond of this idea. Again, several politicians have said that. Canada has said that. Justin Trudeau, the Liberal Party, likes to say a lot of pretty words about reconciliation, but very often it's superficial things, but they still want to keep that power. They still don't want to respect free, prior, and informed consent by Indigenous peoples. Neither does François Legault, Prime Minister of Quebec. So that leads us into this, and we're going to see where that comes back, that idea of free, prior, and informed consent. So our main topic this week is environmental violence. Sorry. Environmental justice is connected. It's fighting against this kind of violence. And so one of the things you're going to be looking at this week is this short video. It's not even 10 minutes long, and I really urge you to watch it and with an open heart. Okay, so I'm going to try to pronounce it from what I know about the Haudenosaunee languages and how they're pronounced. Gazatsden. Our guest Monday will probably be able to pronounce that a lot better. Indigenous resistance to tar sands pipelines. So if you've been paying attention to the news in the past few years, you've probably heard a lot of things about pipelines and a lot of resistance to them, a lot of corporations pushing them through because they're saying it's good for the economy, it's going to give people jobs. Meanwhile, a lot of Indigenous resistors are like, that's not worth the damage that it's causing. And today we're going to look at how it's not just about damage to the physical environment, but on people's health. So in this video, you have a few Indigenous activists who speak up, and it's really interesting, and something I urge you to pay attention to. Early on, there's talk about, there's reference back to things we've talked about in this course in terms of the relationship between people and other living things, including the land itself, the waters, all the animals and plants. Okay, so there's actually somebody in this video who speaks of treaties or agreements between two-leggeds, us humans, and other living beings, and that this is kind of a part of a wider creation story. All right, we talked about the Haudenosaunee creation story. There are other creation stories. Again, some of you have been forgetting to be specific. Sometimes you talk about the Haudenosaunee creation story as though it were the creation story that all Indigenous people share, and that is absolutely not the case. There are different stories, and we'll learn about others. We've been focusing on Haudenosaunee, but we'll talk about others soon. So there's a reference back to kind of early on in creation. There were agreements between two-leggeds and other living beings, just like there are agreements between different groups of humans. Okay, and this person made an analogy with treaties. And there's also mention of a prophecy of a two-headed snake that they link to pipelines. And that's, when we talk about stories, as they're not just fluff, they contain very important information about the world that gets transmitted orally from generation to generation. Well, this is something that comes up a lot. And there's a link with a lot of this that's made. And also in the video, what you'll hear about is people's concerns about the impacts of things like pipelines and tar sands on the physical environment, but also on people's health and well-being. All right, so again, there's this focus in Indigenous worldviews. Generally, there is an understanding that we're in a reciprocal relationship with the environment that we're in. The environment is not just there for us to use and exploit for our benefit. We need to take care of the environment so that it takes care of us. And so the concern here is related to that worldview, because if humans continue to mess up the environment, that environment is not going to continue to nurture us, because we've broken that treaty, we've broken that agreement, we've broken that cycle of reciprocity, you see. So again, everything we've been talking about from the very first week, that gratefulness towards the land, that strong connection to the land, it's not just about ownership, it's about a relationship. And that's what we said about indigenous views of treaties as well. It's about a relationship, and that relationship needs to be maintained. And just as European powers and today federal powers here in the US and a whole bunch of other places, they're breaking these treaties. They've also done that. They've also broken that treaty between humans and other living things. So that's kind of a connection that we can make in that path that we've taken here. So so that's the video. That's again less than 10 minutes. Now there's also a document that I'm asking you to read, and this is from Amanda as well. Amanda has contributed to this document. You'll see their name in there, Amanda Lickers. More about Amanda in a slide coming soon. And the document is entitled Violence on the Land, Violence on Our Bodies. Now, there's an introduction in 4 chapters. It's over 100 pages. You're not expected to read the whole thing this week. We're going to focus on chapter 1. Later in the semester, we might come back to other chapters, either as a class or as we go along. You're going to have more choices each week, and different students can pursue their own interests. So some of those other chapters will sometimes be choices that you'll have as well. So some of you will get to read the whole thing. You can always read the whole thing if you have the time and interest, but we're focusing on chapter 1. If you have a couple of extra minutes, you might look at the intro just to understand the concept of this toolkit, and they also define a couple of things in there that'll help you later on. So you can have a quick look at the intro if you have the time. But chapter 1 is the most important thing to prepare for Amanda's presentation on Monday, February 22nd. So here's a content warning. There is mention of rape culture and consent. And so there's nothing graphic. There's no actual discussion of rape, incidences of rape, or nothing overt. It's mentioned. I say this because I think that it's still fair to warn people, because if you're a survivor of sexual violence or you've witnessed sexual violence, it's very traumatic. And so sometimes even the mention of it can be, this is not a reason to not read this. It's still important to read it, but if you think that these mentions will impact you in some way, it's okay to kind of just wait till you're ready. Prepare yourself. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself. That's if reading it with a friend, or making sure there's a friend or family member that you trust nearby that can help you deal with any emotions. If you see a therapist, and by the way, there's no shame. I've been in therapy for 2 years, very helpful. So you can kind of make sure to have an appointment coming up where we have folks in student services that can help you. And if you're not sure where to go for support and you have difficult emotions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm not a counselor, but I can kind of lead you in the right direction. So that's my little content warning there. So environmental violence, you'll see as you read, this is just one small part of it, okay? So you need to read more than what's on the slide to get the full picture. But in this document, they describe environmental violence as the disproportionate and often devastating impacts that the conscious and deliberate proliferation of environmental toxins and industrial development, including extraction, production, export, and release, have on Indigenous women, children, and future generations without regard from states or corporations for their severe and ongoing harm. So the idea here is, like, if you hear environmental violence, you might think just in terms of like, oh, when corporations pollute the environment, they're committing violence against the environment. And yeah, that's true. But this definition of environmental violence takes into consideration that, first of all, humans are also impacted. So what I said just a couple of minutes before about how if humans are in a relationship of reciprocity with the environment, then if humans don't hold up their end of the agreement and don't help take care of the environment is not going to be able to take care of us. So there's this cycle, right? So So not only does pollution and all these things that they mention harm the environment, but they harm the people who live off of this environment in a relationship with this environment. And that because of the way colonialism has also propagated patriarchal power relations that largely have negative impacts on women, children. Two-spirit people as well are mentioned in the document. Two-spirit refers to, it's rough, it's not completely equivalent, but when we talk about sexual orientation and gender identity, in Western terms, sometimes we talk about lesbian, gay, bisexual identities, asexuality, transgender people, intersex people. So it's kind of inclusive of all those things, but much more nuanced because Two-Spirit has a lot to do with social roles, and we'll talk about that eventually this semester. So we'll talk about this also, like the patriarchal nature of colonialism, but in many indigenous societies, even if they weren't like necessarily matriarchal, there was a lot of egalitarianism and respect for the roles of women and men and people who were neither or both, such as Two-Spirit people. So, colonialism brought patriarchy with it. Not that there were indigenous societies that were a bit more patriarchal, but it wasn't a trend, except that, and sometimes it would be mild power differences, not huge ones that Europeans brought with them. So, because of that patriarchy that came along with colonialism, then a lot of these negative impacts that environmental violence have greater impacts on indigenous women, children, and those of future generations who are essentially not going to benefit at all from this land base. It doesn't mean that this has no impacts on indigenous men or anybody else, right? Non-indigenous people, black and people of color, right? It has impacts on everybody, right? But what they're saying here is, and elsewhere in this report, they also kind of mention people who are racialized in general, because of discrimination. So the idea is that people who are more heavily discriminated in the society are the ones who are going to bear the greater brunt of all of this devastation. So you'll read more about that as you read this week's this chapter. Now, the other thing, there's another section in that chapter that speaks of consent over land and body, and that's important to look at as well. So remember, a few slides ago, I emphasized this concept of free, prior, and informed consent from the United Nations Declaration and how Canada has a problem with that, right? And they have a problem with it in terms, again, of Indigenous people saying, no, this is our land, you can't develop on here because we have to preserve these lands for future generations. Canada doesn't want that because they want to be able to do what they want with that land. So think back to those later treaties where it was more about grabbing land to make room for settlers. That's still the case, but it's also for these corporations. So when we say exploitation, colonialism kind of still is present in a way within settler colonialism. That's what we're talking about. So in this document on page 16, and here they abbreviate free, prior, and informed consent to FPIC. So free, prior, and informed consent means that you have the right to feel fully informed. All right, so the informed part of informed consent, to hear the pros and cons, the right to have a waiting period if you want it. So let me think about this, and hear about other options. Okay, so and then they kind of apply this to this overall discussion and they say it would be impossible to discuss the proliferation of environmental violence, which we just talked about, without first having an understanding of consent, both Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent over their territories, as well as their consent over their bodies. So here they're bringing in this parallel between violence on land and violence on body. And this is where it gets into the territory of sexual violence, gendered violence, rape culture. because there are analogies to be made. Free, prior, and informed consent. We talk about consent culture, right? Replacing rape culture, where anything less than enthusiastic consent to a sexual encounter is a no. Like, you take it as a no unless it's very overtly, and the person knows they're not drunk, they're actually able to consent, right? So there are a lot of parallels to be made there. And they go on to say, since colonization began, the landscape of consent has changed for Indigenous people, their lands, and their bodies. As we heard from Indigenous women and youth, traditional cultures of consent have been impacted by entrenched colonial governance systems in Indigenous communities, by patriarchal and paternalistic solutions to issues around their bodies, and by the intense invasion of their lands and bodies themselves. So basically, the same state that thinks it can just take land also has this attitude that certain people's bodies are up for grabs. And we see this in sexual violence, but we also see it in things that have happened and that still go on in some places in Canada, such as the forced sterilization of Indigenous women. That's a possible research topic that some of you might be interested in. Taking children from their homes. So that happened with residential schools, but it still happens with social services taking kids from families because they think those families can't take care of their own kids, and having those kids adopted by non-Indigenous families. We'll learn about the 60s scoop in this course. Some of you have heard of it, but that's still going on today. So there's this idea of consent over your own body that every individual in the world should have, and also consent over, well, what are you going to do with these lands that we're in a relationship with, that we live off of, and it lives off of us. So again, these are some excerpts to kind of get you thinking, but really go read the document and you'll read more. You'll read some words of people, some testimonials. Again, nothing graphic about actual sexual assault, but you kind of see some of the parallels. And later on in this document, in other chapters, they go into more depth about some of the direct connections that you can make with some of these development projects and assault on people. So, our guest on Monday, who I've mentioned a couple times, who produced that short film that you're going to watch and who contributed, you're going to see Amanda's name in the document, is of the Turtle Clan of the Onondaga Nation, which is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that we've been learning about. So again, everything's connected. So recall the things you've learned about Haudenosaunee cultures and how there are different cultures and languages within that, but they're all part of the Confederacy. Amanda's a spoken word poet and filmmaker, and you can read more about what Amanda has done here. Very much into Indigenous insurrection, grassroots land defense, sovereignty struggles. Lives here in Tiohtià:ke, what we now know as Montreal. And is very much involved in some of these projects of regarding resistance and land defense. So with regards to Indigenous resistance, we can see some connections with the film Trick or Treaty. This isn't a question. The film actually has a question mark as a part of it. So was it a trick or a treaty, right? So by now you've probably seen it. There's this, I've chatted with Amanda before, and it's interesting because Amanda is very much into grassroots resistance, and sometimes the critique of some of the bigger movements you hear about, some that are mentioned in Trick or Treaty, is that sometimes there's very little room there for tactical diversity. So some Indigenous people choose to work from within the colonial system, and some choose to work outside of it. And sometimes some people do a bit of both. And there are tensions between this, and this is something we'll get around to talking about at some point. Some things that come out in this week's material, and also that you could see in Trick or Treaty, is that women and Two-Spirit people have large roles to play in resistance, and youth as well. So again, it doesn't mean there's no room for men and for straight people and older people, right? Everybody can be involved in resistance, but it's very interesting to see that a lot of the leaders are the people who have been most negatively affected. And again, It's not about most negatively affected, because indigenous men, just like racialized men in general, are, very affected in very negative ways. I mean, the rates of incarceration, for example, are astronomical, and that's not because they're all criminals. It's because of a system that puts people in certain positions and also criminalizes a lot of behavior more harshly among people who are racialized. Okay, but it really is important to recognize that the impacts that colonization has on men then sometimes winds up snowballing in its effects on women, two-spirit people, kids, and youth, because of the violence that's inflicted on them from the men who are affected by colonialism. So it's a very difficult topic. It's not easy, and it's not meant to demonize men or demonize anybody, but it's to recognize that things have different impacts on different people. So the people who are affected in some of the more dire ways are often at the head of these resistance movements. So that's it for this week's set of slides and video, and I hope that this helps kind of prepare you for the material you're going to look at. And I said I'd keep this short, so we're almost 25 minutes, but I do want to make sure that you're prepared emotionally and intellectually to kind of intake these new perspectives, which are a bit more, I don't want to say harsh, but a bit more in your face than what we've been looking at. And I think it's important to kind of recognize all these perspectives, all these different indigenous perspectives as valid, and to take them into consideration, especially for people. Many of you have said, "Oh, I want to support indigenous rights." Well, what can I do? Well, you kind of need to start by hearing from the people who are already resisting. So there you go. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. I hope to see a lot of you on Monday. It's during our regular class time, and I know that because I said early on this was asynchronous. I did also say, though, there would be a couple times that we'd be getting together on a Monday, so I hope that a lot of you can make it. That said, I understand that some of you might have taken on other responsibilities knowing that it was asynchronous. If that's the case, if you really can't make it Monday at 4 o'clock, let me know. We'll work something out. And the rest of you, those of you who plan to come, you'll receive the link by Mayo. We're not going to use Zoom on Leia. I'm going to send you a separate Zoom link to join at 4 o'clock on Monday. All right, I'll see you then.